You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to Proof Text and Glossa House TV. I am Michael Halcomb, and this is a Hebrew reading episode that's going to be followed by Hebrew Growcabulary and also an episode of Christ in Classics. So after this, make sure you stick around for those. All right, we've been reading through Malachi, just verse by verse, word by word, verse by verse in Hebrew for a little while now. And today we find ourselves at Malachi chapter 1, verse 10. So I invite you, if you're watching, to check out your screen. If you're just listening, that's fine too. If anything, I want to encourage you to read out loud, whether you are doing that along with me, whether you're repeating after me, whether you wait until I'm done, whatever, work on reading out loud. Now, it's been a couple weeks, probably, since I recorded the last video on this. I've been slammed busy and haven't had a lot of time to do this, so I might be a little rusty. So it's good for me to get back into this and doing some of these recordings. So, all right, here we go. We're going to pick up. I haven't read this, so this is just a cold, fresh reading as usual. But here we go. We have the Nikodem and Dakashim there, the pointings. So, yeah, all right. Mi gam bakim vayisgor daletem veloa tayiru mizbachi chinam ayin li chafetz bakim amar Yahweh Tsevaoth umincha lo eretz miyadkem. All right, so a little bit slow. Let's try to go through it again. So Miram bakim vayisgor daletem veloa ta'aru. I think I missed that word before, like totally. Ta'iru, ta. Now you could do ta'iru, something like that even. You do the I there, but ta'iru, you do it like that. So there's going to be different pronunciation schemas here. I think the standard one you'd hear in biblical studies is something like tairu, something like that. I'd probably go ta'iru, or something like that. Ta'iru. So let's start over. Mikam bakem vayisgor dalatim, or dalatim, some people would say. Dalataim, veloa, tayiru, mitzbachi, chinam, ayin li, chafetz, bakem amar Yahweh Tsevaot, or Sevaot, umincha lo eretz, or lo eretz, miyadkem. All right, let's try it with the pointings off and see how that goes. All right, so let's go back down to verse 10 here. This is kind of a long verse. All right, so here we go. So we have Migam bakim uyisgor daletim veloa ta'aru mitzbachi chanim ayin li chefetz bachem amar Adonai Sevaot vamincha loa eretz miyadkem. To me, that's easier. Yeah, to me, that's a lot easier. Let's try again. Migam bakim vayisgor dalatim veloa tayiru mitzbachi hanim ayin li chefetz bachem amar Adonai Sevaot vamincha loa eretz miyadkem. All right, let's try it one more time with the vowels here. see how that goes. It's really good to be practicing with and without the vowels. So we have Miram Bachim Vayiskor Dalatim Veloa Tayiru Mitzbachi Chinam Ain Li Chafetz Bachim Amar Adonai Tzavaot Umincha Loa Eretz Miedchem. So pretty good. That one's pretty easy, and I'm not just memorizing. Like I start with reading the pointings here, but I'm not just memorizing when I go and read without, right? So there's a whole system, a whole way of reading without the pointings, that helps with that. So I'm seeing things that allow me, a process that allows me to read without the pointings. So yeah, remember, make sure you read out loud and get your reps in. That's really important. All right, stay tuned for a Hebrew Growcabulary episode and then a Christ and Classics episode. All right, friends, I'm going to stop there and say I hope that helps, but stay tuned. All right, friends, we're back, and this is a Hebrew Growcabulary episode where we're thinking about how to grow our Hebrew vocabulary. Today we're thinking about the Greek benyan, the Greek root asaph, and this means to gather. Now, on the spot, I can't think of a mnemonic device. Asaph. I guess I can think of one. It sounds like as if, asaph, as if, azaf. Kind of silly, but um, think of like a group of trying to herd a group of cats. You probably heard that before. Asif, I could herd a group of cats, something like that. Stupid mnemonic device. As Asif, I could gather those cats. Asif, I could gather those things. Asif, as if, right? So there you go. Take it or leave it. That's not really the important thing. That's just an idea. So let's do a quick search on Step Bible and see what we can turn up there. So here we go. I have Step Bible open and hit the search bar, set my keyboard to Hebrew, and type in Asaph and hit enter. And boom, there we go. We have a name, Asaph. Asoph, storehouse, Oseph, gathering. They're related all to Asaph. You can see here it means to gather, to receive. Actually, it can mean to remove, to gather in, collect, to bring up the rear. That's interesting. To assemble, to be gathered. Yeah, to be brought into association with, to harvest, to gather the harvest. And to gather oneself, That's interesting. The first occurrence of this we see in Genesis 6:21, where we have the asafta. And then in 25:8, via asef. And same thing in 25:17, where we have via asef. And in 29:3, vanasefu. Like Vanessa, Vanasefu. In Genesis 29:7, we have Heasef. In 29:8, Sefu. In 29:2, V'Asof. And that form in 30:23, sort of lexical form, Asaf. Yeah, so kind of interesting to see all these V'to Amar Asef Elohim. Yeah, and the son said to gather, Yahweh to gather, and reproach them or shame them or something like that. Shame him. Shame her. Yeah, so interesting to see this. All kinds of occurrences of this term in the Old Testament, various different forms. So means to gather. To gather. And as if I could do that. As if I could gather all those things, all those people. As if, right? All right, it's kind of silly as I said, but there you go, Asaf, to gather. We're gonna stop there and say we hope that helps, but stay tuned for the next episode of Christ in Classics. You're gonna love it. All right, here we go.
Welcome to the Christ and Classics podcast, a podcast that considers the classics in light of the Christ, seeking to understand how the best literary classics find their telos in the gospel. Co-hosted by Devin Wilkinson, Colton Moore, the show utilizes the Socratic method to accomplish its goals and from time to time invites guests to discuss great books, great ideas, and classical Christian education. We hope you enjoy.
Not be all else to me, save that thou art.
I really want to focus 17 through 24, but maybe just a brief overview of Odysseus's trials, if you will. But the big question that I want to land on is Odysseus, having gone through all the sufferings and trials for 20 years, you would expect that the book would end with his reunion with his wife, like at the very end. But it ends with the reunion of him and his father and the kinsmen of the suitors making peace. And so my question is, what's the significance of the epic poem ending with Odysseus returning to his father and not necessarily ending with him returning to his wife? That's
Why
what
do
I'm
you
thinking.
think he should have? Why do you think he should have returned? It should have ended with him returning to his wife.
No, I've thought I was.
Are we?
I guess
Is this the discussion now?
Yeah, we could just go right into it.
All right. I'm fine with that.
No, that's a fair question. Why do I assume that it should end with his reunion with his wife? I think it's because as Odysseus goes from trial to trial, especially in those moments where he's probably about to die. The Cyclops, Polyphemus, being held captive 7 years with Calypso, he's constantly referring to his wife and longing for his wife. And so the first couple times that I read the Odyssey, I was thinking like, oh, okay, he's going to return to his wife at some point. The prophecies make that clear. And then I remember the first time I read it, I was kind of just dumbstruck, like, oh, the book ends with his father and not necessarily his wife. So I guess what would lead me to expect that is just the recurring longing in the tears for Penelope throughout before he gets back to Ithaca.
I like that. Yeah. And when you look at Calypso, when he's on the island of Calypso, he won't marry Calypso. I forget how long he's there. Is it 7 years? But he won't marry Calypso because he's got a wife, and he won't take on immortality. Well, she's a goddess. I don't know what choice you have there. I mean, you're not allowed to disobey the goddesses. I know that we could, if you want to run down that rabbit trail, that's Christians have a hard time, and I think wives especially have a hard time with this whole idea that he's sleeping with these goddesses, and yet he's supposed to be faithful. So, I mean, that's
what do
an
you
issue.
make of that?
Well, the first thing okay, both of these big questions that have come up now, my mind is drawing back and saying, we really have to not think like modern people if we want to understand. To the extent that we can understand it, we really have to try to get into the ancient Greek mind. And I know that some people don't see the value in that. So, all right, but the exercise of getting into an alien mind is a healthy exercise. It doesn't mean you have to stay
It's
there
helpful.
and believe it.
Yes.
Yeah. And so
Yeah.
I would say two things then. One is in relation to why the Father. I want to explore the question I asked you, which is why did you think it should be Penelope? Because I think that's a big question. And then in relation, what was it that I got sidetracked on? The second question?
Oh, that Odysseus forsakes immorality,
sleeps with the goddesses.
immortality, and sleeps with the goddesses.
Yeah, and so we are in the Christian ethic. One thing that's a really big deal is monogamy. I don't think that's a big deal in any other ethic that I'm aware of. Jewish and Christian ethics make a big deal of monogamy. I don't know of. Well, I shouldn't say that. No, I don't know of any other cultures that make as big a deal of monogamy as Christian culture. So that's something we can really cherish that. Like the Odyssey can help us cherish that. But the second thing I would say though is they're goddesses. And I don't know that a mortal really has permission to not do what a goddess says. Now, I don't want to oversimplify that because they do. The goddesses aren't moral, right? The goddesses aren't bound by this. Gods and goddesses, they're immortal. In fact, the Greek word for gods, one of the Greek words for gods, is athanatos, which means those beings that don't die.
Deathless.
Like, thanatoi are human. The word for human sometimes is thanatoi, the dying ones. It's the dead ones. To be human is to be dead. And athanatoi is the immortals. And because they're immortal, there's no need for them to submit to the same ethic that we submit to. So in a way, Odysseus is in this ground between mortality, between the normal everyday mortals and the immortals, because here he is, he's been offered immortality. In which case, then there's no ethic at all that you're really bound to. If you're an immortal, you're not going to die. So what's the big deal? Look at Aphrodite gets wounded, and it's comical. So, but he rejects that. So he chooses mortality, which is an incredible. That's a mind-blowing choice to choose more. Think of those of you who like those of your listeners who like the Lord of the Rings with Aragorn and what's her name, Liv Tyler. Just kidding, Aragorn and Arwen.
Arwen.
And Arwen chooses, she's not immortal, but she's an elf, so she's got millennia, right? And she chooses a short life so that she can spend it with Aragorn. Yeah. And I think that's very romantic. And so with Odysseus, you see that he's choosing mortality, but then one could argue, he's only partially choosing it because he's not completely accepting the ethic that would come with being mortal. We could say that now, that the ethic of that comes with being mortal is that you have to make a choice about who you're married to, and that's who you're married to, and there's unless that person dies, you're bound to that person for your whole life, and that's a condition, that's a state of being mortal, right? So is he wavering between the two? You never know with Odysseus, right? He's not meant to be. He's polytropic is the word that Homer uses in the very first line, right? He's polytropic, which is an untranslatable word because it's representing an untranslatable person, right? He's a man of many forms and a man of many wanderings, a man of many dreams, a man of many insights. Is he just a human being or is he a normal human being and we're supposed to imitate him, or is he a transcendent human being who we could never hope to imitate? The answer seems to be both in Homer. And there's anytime you pin him down, literally even, anytime you pin him down, he moves. Right? And so yes. Maybe that's the answer to the other question.
It's like even right at the very end, whenever he meets his father, he almost immediately reveals himself, and you expect him to, Father, I'm back. But he decides a better route, which would be to test him.
Yeah.
And then he kind of hurls these soft insults at Laertes, which brings Laertes to his knees, and then Odysseus can't handle it anymore, and he finally reveals who he is.
And
so
you shake your head. You're going, "What is your problem?" Right? That's it's impossible. If a reader is idealizing Odysseus and going, "Okay, this is the Greek model for the perfect man, and everything he does, I'll understand it, and I should do it." Well, those two things are not going to happen. You're not going to understand most of what Odysseus does, and you shouldn't do most of what Odysseus does because you're not Odysseus. And yet, Odysseus is wisest. The virtue that's being celebrated in the Odyssey is the virtue of wisdom, right? And so we're supposed to look at this character, and he's always just beyond our reach. And even to your point about the end where he sees his dad, right, and he breaks his father's heart, and then they hug. Well, even there, he's just told Penelope, "You know what? I have to leave again." Right. So you pointed out that the story does end with the Athena bringing peace to the island. Okay, but Odysseus has to leave right away. And Dante, I think, he kind of, in my opinion, Dante misunderstands that, because it's okay because Dante doesn't have Homer, but he misunderstands this Odyssean character because it's not that he wants to leave; he has to leave. The gods telling me. If people haven't read the end of the book, you don't worry about it because the end of the book is told in the 12th book. So it's. But the thing about the Odyssey is that on the one hand, it's just a really simple story and it's amusing and a kid can like it just fine. But on the other hand, you're never, ever going to get it. I mean, it just keeps slipping away and slipping away. It's Protean, to use a character from, is that the Iliad or the Odyssey where they talk about Proteus? I think it's the Odyssey. But Proteus is this character that he's Protean. He changes. You capture him, and then you have to hold on to him. Yeah, it's the Odyssey. Odysseus is supposed to capture him, and then he'll become something else. And then he has to still hold tight, and he'll become something, like he'll become a human, and then a fish, and then a bull, or I forget all the different things. But and that's Odysseus. He's just a Protean, and that's the Odyssey. It's a Protean book. So on the one hand, if you're reading it for the first time, just enjoy the story. Don't try to fully understand it. And if you're reading it the third or fourth time and it's starting to get annoying because things just keep sliding away from you, don't worry about it. Just keep on going into it. Hamlet will do the same thing to you. All the great works of art, that they have a way of there being, that you think they're really clear, and then boom, they move on you. And that's because they're always trying to lead you, to put Lewis's phrase on it, they're always trying to lead you further in and further up.
This really plays into the whole theme of weaving. This time around, with the entire Odyssey, I took in the back of my copy, and I made an index of every single instance where weaving was mentioned and who was weaving and why. And you've got Penelope weaving this shroud for Laertes, and then as soon as she's about to finish it and the suitors get their hopes up, she does exactly what Odysseus does and and unweaves it, and it slips away from them. And then you hear all throughout that Athena is gifted with weaving, and Odysseus is weaving a plot against the suitors, and Penelope's weaving. You even get Odysseus's cowherd, who's faithful to him, says that the gods weave trouble for us. Right. And then you could even think of weaving, as you've just mentioned, as Homer weaving a story that we can't grasp, with the gods weaving Odysseus's story that he can't grasp, and the suitors, and it's very interesting, and it begs the question: well, why the feminine task of weaving?
Yeah.
Why specifically that instead of the language of building a craft? I guess my modern mind probably goes more quickly to constructing and building things upward than maybe the ancient mind. But I think it really plays down from the author all the way down. Perhaps Homer is weaving this story where the gods weave a story for Odysseus and Penelope, and in
Homer's mind, mind, it would go up. In other words, Homer has appealed in the first line to the muses. So Homer himself is being, well, he's not the source. The muses are the source. So the muses are weaving, and they're women. And then who's weaving through the muses? That would be the god, right? That would be maybe Zeus, but probably the god. And what are the fates doing? Right? The fates are putting out threads and cutting them. So there's no limit to the power of this metaphor. And I love that you created that index, because my glib answer, for those of you who want, your listeners again, who want a glib answer so they can pin it to the bulletin board, is that there's probably no better metaphor I can't think of one in terms of human society for wisdom, which is to say wisdom is weaving. I would also add that the word wife is an Anglo-Saxon. It's an ancient, it's a medieval Anglo-Saxon term that means weaver, right? And the woman is not only physically externalizing the act of weaving on a loom, but she is, through her womb and through her virtues as a wife, she is the loom that weaves society. And that's why she's called a wife, but a single woman is called a spinster, right? A single woman used to be called, not as a mark of disrespect, although it probably became one, but the concept of spinning threads indicates that this is a person who is going to prepare, who's going to support the work of the wife who weaves society together, but she herself doesn't have the mother-child relationship on which civilization is based. And so everything in human existence can be best understood, or everything can be understood with the metaphor of weaving. And that's one of the things that Homer's drawing out for us by doing it by weaving so effectively. Even music is is analogous to weaving.
Yeah. Penelope, it struck me at the very end, at the beginning of book 24.
Oh yeah. I think I know where you're going, and I love it.
They're in the house of death.
Yep.
Achilles and Agamemnon are discussing with one another, and this is where, if you've only read the Iliad and you're like, "Where's Achilles? Like, how does he die? I know he dies, but it's not in the Iliad." Well, it gives you a summary, some sort of version here, although it doesn't talk about his heel, which will come about later in Greek literature. But then Agamemnon and Achilles get word that the suitors, their ghosts, have come down to the house of death, and I've got Fagel's edition, and it's in line like 205 or something. And Agamemnon asks them, "Well, how'd you die, suitors?" And the suitors like, "Well, we were courting Penelope. Odysseus came back. He and Telemachus and the cowherd and the swineherd, they slaughtered us." And instead of saying something like, "Oh wow, what a grisly death," he says, quote, "Happy Odysseus, son of old Laertes' mastermind, what a fine, faithful wife you've won. What good sense resided in your Penelope. How well Icarus' daughter remembered you. Odysseus, the man she married." And then she says, "The fame of her great virtue will never die." And that struck me, that line.
Well, keep going.
The fame of her great virtue, which she... Okay, the immortal gods, there we go, will lift a song for all mankind, a glorious song in praise of self-possessed Penelope, and then contrasted with a far cry from the daughter of Tyndareus Clytemnestra. What an outrage she committed, killing the man she married once. Yes, the song men sing of her will ring with loathing. She brands with a foul name the breed of womankind, even the honest ones to come. And what struck me about that passage is that right before it, Agamemnon was just praising Achilles back in line 100 for the great glory that he chose and he received, which he doesn't really enjoy in death, but which he was promised by his mother back in the Iliad. But two vastly different glories that are being sung about.
Yeah. And notice that okay, in the translation I've got here, it's therefore the fame of her virtue will never perish. Okay, I love that. And then, but the immortals will make a gracious song in the ears of men on earth about the fame of faithful Penelope. Okay, so here's a question I got for you. Did the immortals ever sing that song? Is there a song about faithful Penelope?
Oh, interesting. In this epic?
Is there one?
In Greek literature in general?
Is there one at all? Is what Agamemnon says there ever realized?
I can't recall, but something tells me something at the very beginning where the gods are counseling and talking with one another. I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
What if you're holding it in your hand?
Oh. The Odyssey itself.
What if that's what the Odyssey is? A song in Lattimore, a song for prudent Penelope.
You see, that's very, very, very interesting because we have a similar passage in our New Testament where every generation will call her blessed, the Blessed Mary.
Right.
And how does that happen? Well, the carrying on of the Holy Scriptures by the church.
And the songs they sing to her.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, that's my conviction.
Interesting. Okay, so
I think the Odyssey is actually a song for prudent Penelope, or faithful Penelope, or I think you said self-possessed.
Could there if that's true, then like would the antithesis of that on the flip side be the unfaithful Helen of the Iliad? As like a photo negative of Penelope?
Sure. Also, as you just pointed out, it would be Agamemnon's wife.
Yep.
I did. There aren't very many women as faithful as Penelope, is what Homer's getting at. And so when there's somebody like that who waits 20 years for her husband to come home, then that person needs to be sung. But it's not, see, this comes back also to the original question. It's not a romance, especially not in the modern sense. It's a romance, but it's not a romantic story. Because the Greek conception of marriage wasn't as childish as ours, right? They didn't get all their inspiration about what a marriage should be from TV shows and pop songs. Right. The whole thing, this individualistic notion that we have, where a marriage, even the notion I said earlier that that the word wife means weave, that it's a weaver. Okay. That because the wife is what makes society possible. Okay. Our society is demonstrating that by not having wives play the role of wives. Right. And so when you think of society as made up of atoms that come together and form molecules, like we do, individuals who come together as individuals, as they're autonomous, and then they make this voluntary, autonomous commitment to each other. And for a while, they got it verified by the church, and now they just do it at whatever. They just move in together. Okay, the whole notion that it's two individuals coming together to form a new society is just childish, right? And no society can survive that, as ours is demonstrating. When the Greeks thought about marriage, they thought about it as a think of the tapestry again. You've got knots, right? You've got a starting point on the tapestry, and then you have a whole world that's generated out of that knot. And in a way like that, that's what marriage is. It's a bringing together of worlds. You see this, for example, in Shakespeare when Romeo and Juliet, or any other marriage. It's never two individuals getting married. It's two worlds coming together in the person of two people who are participants in these two different worlds. And that's why you get comedies and tragedies, right? A comedy is when two societies come together. They have a tension because you cannot bring two societies together without conflict. It can't be done. Okay. Whether that's male and female, like two individuals, male and female. If a man and a woman come together, it's going to be hard. Okay. If two people come together, it's going to be hard. So the more you multiply that and the more you differentiate, the harder it's going to be. Okay. So whenever two societies come together, you're going to have tension. In a comedy, something happens where that tension gets resolved and a new society is created. And that's why you could say the Odyssey might be a comedy, right? It ends with a new society, a new order. Maybe. Okay. But in a tragedy, what happens is two societies come together, two cultures come together, and they can't reconcile. Or within a culture, there's two parties that can't reconcile. And so the society itself might be destroyed. Right? And I think that's more like what you see in the Iliad, although you could say that there's a tragic and a comedic element to the two, but they're not exactly tragedy and comedy. That comes later. But he does plant the seeds of it. But what I'm getting at is when you look at it as though two individuals are coming together, then you're going to say, oh, well, why did they go on? Why is there this other story? But when you understand marriage itself as being worlds being created, right, and as in a very deep sense, a procreative act, right? It's a new world. It's not just bearing children; it's bearing a world. And then the faithfulness of the partners to each other is the means by which that world that's newly created flourishes, right? And that's Genesis 1, that's Genesis 2 and 3. And that's why I think the Odyssey is such a magical story, is because it captures that better than almost any other story ever told. And so that I think possibly that might be why it doesn't end with two individuals being happy to see each other again.
Yeah. I was just about to say that because I think perhaps that question I had was too myopic. Like Odysseus isn't just coming home to his wife, but he's coming home to his kingdom. He's coming home to his family and his people,
to his responsibilities, even.
Right. Yeah. At which Athena, undercover and in cryptic fashion, ratifies and asserts right at the very end on behalf of Odysseus that the king has come home,
right,
and he's assuming his responsibilities, and we have peace with our enemies. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's really helpful. That's very helpful. It's very helpful. I found it interesting that I mean, it's a minor point, but there's little parallels like this all over the place, where Odysseus will kill like the Antinous. In my translation, it's Antinous, the leader of the suitors. He's the first one who he wings the arrow in the hall with, and then Laertes right there at the end on the battlefield kills Antinous' father. So it's like father, like son.
Yeah. They're also the highest ranked. He's the highest ranked suitor, and his father is the highest ranked islander. So that if Odysseus was overthrown, then it would be the Antinous' family that becomes the new monarch. Yeah.
And Odysseus is, you could say, the highest ranked suitor when he returns. And I guess, but it's interesting that both the Iliad and the Odyssey, a major theme of both books is marriage and infidelity. Like the entire Trojan War, so says tradition. The Iliad didn't cover this all, but was because of Helen and being stolen by Aphrodite, being duped or transfixed. She committed infidelity with Paris. Menelaus gets led by Agamemnon, gets all the Greeks to come take vengeance upon that great sin. They destroy Troy. They come back. Agamemnon is betrayed by his wife and then killed by her lover, whom is also killed is avenged by his son. And then you've got Odysseus and Penelope with the wily, adulterous suitors vying for her affection, and then he comes and takes revenge on them. And so, to your point that perhaps the Odyssey is a book about Penelope's faithfulness, that could just be further warrant for that. It's a very provocative thought. Which if true, and if what you've said about Homer and his crafty weaving, his slipperiness, if you will, it could be more evidence for that as well. That like Odysseus is front and center, but really the poem is about Penelope's faithfulness.
Let me draw an analogy there. Dante does the same thing. Okay, in Dante, the more space a character gets, for the most part, the less important he is. And so, I mean, that's not strictly true, but if you think about it this way, you think of the less space a teacher of his gets, the more important the teacher is. So he meets Virgil at the beginning, and Virgil takes him all the way through the Inferno and through 2/3 of the Purgatorio. Then he gets to the mountain, the top of the mountain, and that's when he meets Beatrice. He sees Beatrice, okay? And of course, Beatrice is the woman that he loves, and it's the source of all blessing. That's what Beatrice means, she who blesses. So then she leads him, but nowhere near as long. Well, not as much as Virgil did. She leads him, I think, for approximately the rest of Purgatorio and about 2/3, let's say, of Paradiso. Okay, and then she hands him off to, I think it's is it Bonaventure? St. Bernard. And I think St. Bernard gets 3 or 4 books. And then St. Bernard hands him off to the Blessed Mother. She gets about a book. And then God gets about 3 lines. Right. And so, and he's a point, which literally has no parts, right? So the more important, so the more important something is, the less space it occupies on the surface. But at the same time, the more it permeates all of existence. And so there's not a line in the Odyssey in which Penelope isn't present. In a similar way, there's not a speck on the earth. There's not a speck on earth or heaven where God isn't present. And yet he's not noisy, right? The Lord is not noisy. He's just always present. And so always present that often we don't notice him. And Penelope's like that too. You often don't notice her. It's also an interesting thing. Those who want to ascribe it to sexism can be permitted to do so, because in Pericles' funeral oration, he talks about how the right role of a woman is to be quiet and stay home, right? And so, your fame is not going to be for getting out in public and making a big fuss. Your fame is for holding the home together. And of course, if public life is what you value the most, then that's offensive. But if home life is what's most important, then there's a nobility in it. But I think, some people see it as being exceptionally restrictive and whatever. But the fact is that the Greeks, in varying ways and in different periods, there's no simple way to put it because it's human, but the Greeks tended to think of the home as the woman's domain, and to think of the best virtues for the home as quietness, dignity, order, not going out into the public and making a fuss, certainly not going off to fight wars. That would be just, unless they were Spartans, that would be utterly humiliating. Well, even the Spartans, I think, even it would be humiliating. Maybe I was thinking of Amazons.
So it's interesting. What Lewis, as Michael Ward has argued in his really big Planet Narnia, wove into those 7 books in a cryptic, quiet fashion his interests in medieval cosmology. And so it makes for a fascinating read. I mean, I think to to grasp those kinds of details in a work, it requires multiple readings to uncover layers. But nonetheless, it makes for a fascinating read. That what is front and center in a novel or a piece of literature isn't always what's front and center. Why do you think that makes for such a wonderful story?
Well, there's a lot of reasons, but two that come immediately to mind are because we like games, right? We like having always something more to look for, and the second of all, because it's so well hidden. If it was not so well hidden, then it would be annoying. In other words, if you felt like there's this game that Lewis is playing, and the goal of reading the Chronicles of Narnia is to figure out which planet you're talking about, now, that would just be irritating. In fact, I would say that nobody who's reading Narnia for the first time should even think about that, right? Because it's just distracting.
Right.
It'll take you away. And Lewis would be bothered if you did,
yes,
based on his experimenting criticism. But once you've read it and you're thinking about Lewis's worldview and stuff like that, then it becomes super interesting, because now it's taking you. Well, what it is it's the loom now. It's a loom on which all of Lewis's writings can be woven, right? There's a tapestry there, and it's really a key to his whole mind, and that's what a lot of people are exploring now, is the medieval mind of C.S. Lewis. And I think it was brilliant of Ward to figure it out, and it was incredibly cunning of Lewis, because I suspect Tolkien, for example, didn't see that, because otherwise he wouldn't have. I don't think he'd have hated the Narnia as much as he did if he'd known that. But he might have still, because it was philosophical. But the playmanship, the playmanship of it, the fact that we like games is part of it. But also, let's push that a bit further. It leaves it so that there's always a little bit more to wonder about, and we like that too. We like to have ever deeper harmonies, right? So you read something once, you read a Dr. Seuss story once or twice, and you've got it. Or you listen to a pop song 3 or 4 times, you've probably got it. But then it's not very satisfying. What you want is a song that keeps on having more to offer for the 5,000 times you listen to it, right? So, I can remember as a kid, I listened to pop music way too much. And there was one station in particular that whatever song was really popular. This is back when there were radios playing music. Whatever song was popular, they would play. They had a rotation going for 2 hours. So by the end of the day, I might have heard all the popular songs 2 or 3 times, right? At the end of a week at that rate, you just get sick of it. I mean, that's a lot of listening to the radio there, but let's say 2 or 3 weeks, you get sick of it, because they just don't sustain. They don't raise more questions. Meanwhile, forgive me, but if you're listening to the Beatles, let's say, most of the Beatles songs, there's always something new that you can find in there. Even the early stuff is so creative, and there's always something they're changing. It sounds at first like just any old pop song, but then you see that there's some twist they played on a chord, or there's some change, and we like that. We like it because on the surface it satisfies us on first contact, right? Like Homer and Lewis. Lewis maybe more so because it's written for our culture, but you like having a good story. Just let it be a good story. But then as you come back to it, and over and over and over and over again, there's more and more and more. And I think that points to the biggest reason, which is that's reality. Right? Reality is so stunningly beautiful. The beauties of this world that God has made will never, ever be exhausted. Okay, forgive me, I'm getting carried away now, but I'll just say this. One of the worst things about a habit that we get from going to school is that we feel like we can say, I get that now. But there's nothing that you will ever be able to say that about. Nothing. Whether it be your spouse or a rock on your front lawn, there's nothing that you will ever understand. And the reason for that is because God's not that boring, and neither are you, right? There's always some new relation, some new manifestation, some new wonder in everything. And when you first realize that, it can be annoying and intimidating, because how are you going to get a grade on that then? But you got to just escape that, because the world, my favorite poem almost, Robert Louis Stevenson, it's at the beginning of A Child's Garden of Verses. It's very simple. It goes like this. The world is so full of a number of things. I'm sure we should all be as happy as kings. But instead, we go to school and we learn to complain about not understanding everything fully. I mean, we would just waste so much time trying to understand things that we should be enjoying. Anyway, got carried away there.
Yeah.
I wrote a book about it.
No, that's great. That's wonderful. It like I got three thoughts, but the first thought just comes off what you just last said. Like we get so caught up in trying to understand things than just enjoying them. And so that Lewis speaks to that in his short little essay, meditation in a tool shed. Like the difference between looking by the light, looking at the light, like examining for understanding, and looking along or by the light, where the light is illuminating your vision. There's a place for both. There's a place for really enjoying Homer's Odyssey, and then there's a real legitimate place for examining every single simile in the Odyssey to see how they function, and for the literary features and whatnot. So the answer to my question, you answered, like the answer to the question, why does making some of the most important themes less prominent in a book make for a fascinating read? And you said, well, reality is structured that way, but it also, in order to raise more questions, this kind of story, this kind of history, keeps raising more and more questions. And that reminded me of it was a speech, I think, given in 1971 at St. John's in Annapolis by Jacob Klein. It's a short little 2-page speech, now an article called Discussion as a Means of Teaching and Learning. And one major point that he makes in that speech is that the St. John's seminar, the Socratic seminar that they're known for, is not necessarily so that students can raise questions and answer them, but it's more so to raise questions to show us all the various options of questions that are out there. So it's a way to ask a question in such a way that shows you on the table all the other questions that could be asked. And it reminds me of this book, because this poem and other works like it, that you read it once and you get the main plot and it's enjoyable. You read it a second time and there's another layer that raises other questions. And then by your third, fourth, fifth, sixth times through, you're asking questions that weren't even on the radar your first and second time around. And the enjoyment and the investigation just increases.
There's a scary side to that, though, and an impractical side too. It's scary because we need answers, and it's impractical because we don't have time to. We have lives to live. We have to eat. We have to, do all that. But I think the solution to that, to both of those, is to remember the infinite goodness of God, because to know. Okay, the solution, I think, is, again, Lewis gives us the perfect metaphor, and it's the garden in the last battle, where all these Narnians are running along, and they're going, they have all the energy, they don't get tired, they're running as fast as they can. Then they see this little garden in front of them, and it's beautiful, and they know they should go in it, but it looks too tiny. So then they go into it, and as they enter, it becomes bigger than the whole world that they just left. And I think truth is like that. And what we do, though, is we treat truth. This might unnerve people too, but we treat truth as though it's a proposition, it's a statement that corresponds to reality. But that's true, that a statement that corresponds to reality is true, but that's not truth. The truth is the reality that the statement corresponds to. So a statement is true, and being is truth. And there is no statement that I can ever make that will exhaust the truth that it's referring to. And what I mean is, if I say something like the wall to my right is cream colored, okay, that's a simple statement, and you can look at it and agree or disagree. But then as you start looking at that wall, you're not going to ever leave that truth behind. You're going to enter into that truth more and more deeply. You're going to say, yes, it's cream colored and it has nail holes in it. and it's slightly off the cream, and there's shade, right? And the closer you look, the deeper the truth becomes, and the more truth, the more texture the truth has. And that's what we're talking about. We're not saying that questions are an end in themselves, right? We're not saying that there's no knowable truth. We're saying that the truth that you can know is always going to be infinite. Every truth is going to be beyond your capacity to exhaust. But there's a big difference between exhausting a truth and not being able to enjoy a truth, right? And I think, let me just say this.
Yeah.
One of the problems that I think Christians have, a corner they've trapped themselves in by accident, is that relativism having become such a big deal, Christians have a way of opposing absolutism to relativism as though absolutism is absolutely not relative. Okay. And in other words, there's the relative, right? And then there's the absolute, and they have nothing to do with each other. But absolute truth has a relative quality to it. Okay. When the relative becomes absolute, it becomes violent. Okay. So that's something D.C. Schindler explains really clearly in one of his books. But the idea here, relative means in relation to something finite, right? So when it says, for example, man is the measure of all things, okay, if I measure things against myself and I am the one who determines whether something is good or true or beautiful or bad or whatever, that's relativism. Okay, and that's the modern world completely. Okay, they're absolutely relativistic. That's why they're violent. But absolute truth contains the relative within it and then orders it rightly. And what I mean by that is this. If something is absolutely true or good, let's say if something is absolutely good, it will never change. God is absolutely good. He will never change, but he will never be known in his absolute goodness because you aren't capable. Well, he will know himself that way, but you and I, we're not capable of knowing him in his absolute goodness. But in his humility, he takes on what you could call a relation. He takes on he incarnates himself in order to become relative to us. In other words, now we can have a relationship with him. Now, the absolute good is still the standard by which we measure ourselves, but we can't know the absolute good. And so the relative is contained within that absolute. Okay. Now, if the relative denies the absolute, then it makes itself absolute and becomes violent. Okay. But when the Christian holds to this absoluteness in conflict with every sort of relativism, then I hate to say this, but he's just become a relativist. And a lot of, in other words, the Christian has become the Christian's doctrine, the Christian's understanding of doctrine and goodness and reality. That Christian has become the standard by which he's going to measure everything else. If I go measuring the whole world by the way I understand it, then I'm the one. That's what Jesus, I believe, is talking about when he says, judge not lest you be judged. Okay, don't make yourself the standard by which everything is judged. Okay, then you're a relativist. Right. Instead, acknowledge that absolute goodness is always beyond you. You don't understand, and now you have to take a very humble position. And now, I forgot how that got started on that whole rabbit trail, but it relates to this whole discussion that somehow came out of us talking about the Odyssey and God and Lewis and everything that we've been talking about. Because what Christians have done in our culture is they've turned their formulations. We have turned our formulations of our doctrine into absolute dogma that then people have to agree with our statements when our statements ought to be pointing people to God. And I recognize there's a challenge and there's a difficulty in this. I'm not denying the truth of Christian dogma. I am denying the truthfulness of our understanding of some Christian dogma often, but I'm not denying the truth of Christian dogma. What I'm saying is our statements are all our statements. They represent truth. And they can even be true statements. But if we hold up the statement and the argument as the truth instead of the thing that argument or that statement is talking about, then we've made ourselves the master. And in that ironic twist, we've become relativistic. I'm really sorry for going down that rabbit trail because I probably just created a lot of confusion.
No, it's relevant, I think, because
it's relative.
It's our. Well, you just said our statements ought to represent. Ought to. What did you say? Our statements.
They represent the
truth.
God. Apart. They
represent. So they're metaphoric. They're metaphoric in nature, and it's interesting because I sense a similar thing like happening in Iliad and the Odyssey with Homer. I'm not a Homeric scholar. My degrees aren't in the classics, but what little I know about Homer, I see a lot woven into the tapestry of these two epic poems, and it's like, is Homer? Are the characters in here, not just Odysseus but others? Are these metaphoric representations of the man Homer, or could they be? If that makes any sense. So, like, what you're saying is somewhat related to what I'm saying here. Like faithfulness of Penelope, is that somehow representing something about the man Homer, or the crafty cleverness, the slipperiness of the weaving of Odysseus throughout the poem? Is Homer? Could Homer be telling us something about himself, the author, in that regard, as these characters metaphorically represent whom he might be?
Yeah, at the very least, he had to be capable of telling those stories. I think two things come out in my mind as you asked that really good question. The first is, and it relates to the whole relativism thing that I just blew the world up on.
Mm-hmm.
Your capacity to perceive the good depends on the goodness of your own soul, right? In other words, agreeing with statements about reality doesn't mean you know the reality that those statements refer to. And Jesus says that the lamp of the body is the eye, right? If you can't perceive truth, then the words that other people use to talk about it don't mean anything. And you can agree because it's socially acceptable to agree, but that doesn't mean you know the truth, right? And what I'm getting at is, and what you helped me see is that if Homer is writing about himself, then if he's somehow expressing himself, then he has to be the kind of person who is capable of gaining the insights that the Iliad and the Odyssey have. In parallel, when you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, you have to be the kind of person who's capable of receiving the insights that the Iliad and the Odyssey offer. And the way you interpret the Iliad and the Odyssey is going to be determined by the kind of person you are and your capacity. I think that's something Plato really, really works hard to, as Kierkegaard does too. They work hard to bring that out. That, if you read Aristotle, it's so methodical that it almost doesn't matter what your character is. It matters if you're willing to work hard. And you're going to agree with things based on your own preferences. Of course, that's always the case. But I think with Plato and other really great, well, certainly Jesus, everything depends on the receptivity of your spirit to what's being said. Right? And that depends on your character, your humility. It depends on who you are. And it then engages you and cultivates in you a capacity to see more clearly, if you are willing to take the first step, right? So Plato, if you're willing to engage him in that first step on the journey, he'll guide you. Odysseus, if you're willing to engage in that first step on the journey, he's going to guide you. Homer's going to guide you. So that's the first thought, is that it might say something about Homer in terms of his own character and what he was capable of perceiving. But I think another thing, I noted that when he doesn't murder the singer, right?
So I was just looking that up as the bard. Yes.
Yeah, I noticed that when he doesn't murder the bard or kill the bard, it's the bard says he taught himself, and I'm intrigued by that because I don't believe it. I don't think that you. Well, maybe I don't know. I don't think you can become a great bard on your own, right? It's like the whole marriage thing we talked about earlier. And probably the historical character Homer, to the extent that there was one, probably he was singing, being taught how to sing when he was 3 or 4 years old. He was probably being apprenticed as a bard when he was a little kid. And so he was part of a community. And I would add to that he's doing his singing, the character who might have been the person Homer would have lived somewhere around the middle of the 8th century, which is around the time the Phoenician alphabet hits Greece. And there are many who believe, and I'm one of them, that the alphabet as we think of it was developed specifically for Homer. And what I mean is that the vowels were added. And if you don't have vowels in an alphabet, you don't have the same kind of alphabet, right? And the reason for vowels apparently is the musicality, that you had to have long and short, and you had to have open and closed and so on vowels. And so they needed to add vowels in order to preserve Homer's poetry. So in other words, he's at the very beginning of what we would consider written literature, but that means he's at the end of something. And that means he's a transitional character where all these threads, to go back to weaving, all of these threads of Greek mythology and Greek legends and Greek stories and Greek history, they're all coming together and they're converging on this Homer character. So Homer is weaving together hundreds and hundreds of years worth of cultural wisdom. And then he's taking it with his genius and writing an almost perfect poem. Probably the two most perfect poems that the world has ever seen. And I'm not qualified to say that, but stuff I've read indicate it. So the two things I'm thinking here is, one, Homer had to have the character to write the Iliad and the Odyssey, and we have to have the character to read it and receive it. And two, he had to be part of a community that was capable of producing the Iliad and the Odyssey. And I believe he was both of those. And I believe that his goal, I really believe this, that his goal in writing the Iliad and the Odyssey was, he was saying to the Achaean, the Hellenistic, to the Hellenes, he was saying to them, look, you're on the brink of being born, of becoming civilized. I mean, he wouldn't have put it this way, of course not. We can say this after the fact, but he's saying to them, you're at the beginning of being civilized people. Let me show you, let me give you the questions that you're going to have to ask relentlessly to become truly civilized. And I think that's what the Iliad and the Odyssey are. That's what gives birth to Greek philosophy. That's what gives birth to Greek art, to Greek, especially Athenian poetry and Greek culture. All of that, I think, is being. I don't mean that Homer spins it out of the air. I mean that he's taking everything that's coming down to him, and he's refining it, and by sheer genius, inspiration, the muses, he's the teacher of the Greeks, and they all said so. Plato said so. Socrates said so. Aristotle said so. He's our teacher, and he did it. He did it not by telling them explicitly, but by creating. I mean, look, we're still 2,800 years later. We are still studying Homer to figure out, what is he telling us about our soul, and it's a lot.
And if you're right that the poems, the diptych, to some degree or another, had some sort of exhortation to the people in some fashion about what it means to be a civilized
than an exhortation, Greek. I think.
That's good. Then it's striking that it seems to me at the heart of both stories, or the single story, is the cherishing of marital fidelity and the abhorrence of adultery.
Yes.
And so with that is like, that's incredibly relevant for us, because we live in a society that is the complete opposite, and we're seeing things dissolve. But it's also strikingly ironic, because the very deities that are meant to govern the Greek mind are just full of adulterers.
But they're immortal.
Zeus and all the other gods, different standard.
Well, they don't die. They don't.
You mentioned that.
In the Greek mind, they don't need our ethic. They don't need to be civilized. They're not going to die. They don't have tragedy, right? So they don't need a tragic ethic like we do. In other words, they don't have. They're not finite, like so they don't have to make choices.
Yeah, but it's interesting because it's not like they just accept their ethic and that's a whole other standard, such that Zeus has a string of 4 or 5 women and that's okay. No, it's negatively portrayed. So they have this moral dilemma where Zeus can act immorally, but yet still is on a different standard than the humans. But
that's really interesting.
To your point, yeah. I mean,
go ahead.
The gods will praise Penelope at the end. The gods will praise Penelope at the end of the Odyssey. And so what does that assume about the gods' morality? Like, well, faithfulness and endurance and hope they value.
Yeah, if only because they see that humans need it, but that the mortals, that the dead ones need it. But even so, I think you're onto something else, which is that underlying ethics in the Greek mind, and in ours too, we just don't admit it. Underlying ethics is the question of honor. And the reason that the gods value fidelity isn't so much because they need it. For us, there's practical benefits to fidelity, right? Our society survives. We do better. We get richer. We flourish. If the husband and wife are faithful, all of society flourishes. That's true of mortals. That doesn't matter to the gods. But what does matter to the gods is being humiliated. And so Hera, she gets so angry at Zeus because he's constantly humiliating her. I mean, what we can forget about Hera is that it was a close call when Paris had to judge between Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. And the only reason he picked Aphrodite isn't because she was more beautiful than Hera. It was because she offered him the most beautiful. It was because his appetites were so degraded, right? And so Hera was a goddess, right? We use the term now, like, of an actress or something. She was a goddess who had unfathomable beauty and was never going to die, right? And yet Zeus insulted her. Zeus was not satisfied with her. Yeah. And I think that's an important, you've helped me see something that excites me a little bit here, which is how the divine in us, if you can put it that way, the divine image in us is that sense of, in the best sense of the term, of our sense of pride or dignity, let's say, our sense of dignity. And when our sense of dignity is betrayed, we are hurt by that. We're offended by that. And I think that's why Jesus says in the Lord's Prayer, it's so intriguing to me that he says, forgive us our debts, right? I know we say trespasses, but the word he uses is debts. And I got thinking, okay, so forgive us our debts. What does anybody owe me? What debt do I have to forgive anybody else? But they do have debts to me. For example, if they say they're going to do something for me, they owe me that. There's that. But why? What makes me a person that they owe something to? The fact that I'm the divine image, right? And because of that, you owe me respect. And if you don't give it to me, you've sinned against me. You've sinned against God. And so therefore, my task is to forgive you, right? But that doesn't mean that doesn't mean I'm not forgiving something, right? I'm forgiving a debt. People owe each other that. And I think we see that in the gods, and the ethic, let's call it the ethic of the gods, right? There's the ethic of the belly, which is Paris. And then there's the ethic of society, which is fidelity for the sake of civilization working. And then there's the ethic of the gods, which is that sense of honor. And that's where Odysseus and Achilles and all the Greeks are so obsessed with. Well, so is Paul. Kleos and time are the words glory and honor.
Well, I was going to say, so is God in Romans 2, to those who seek for glory and honor and immortality, he will give it eternal life.
Right.
It's built into us to want glory. Of the right kind.
Right. Right.
with the right object. It's interesting. You mentioned that the divine in us. Several years ago, I wrote an article that was published, and at the very end, I listed out some further thoughts that could be further explored, and one of them was that whenever we sin against somebody else's flesh, whether physically or sexually, or mainly in those two ways, because they're really physical, especially murder, like, because they're in the image of God, to a degree, their flesh is the very flesh of God, and you're sinning against God by sinning against them, who is also his flesh, in a sense. And so it's interesting that when humans sin against one another, God is so wrapped up in the human that you're sinning against God himself, which is different from what I sense in the Iliad and Odyssey, where humans sin, to use that anachronistic term, against one another. The gods don't see it as an offense to them. Like, they're just killing each other or harming one another. Is that a fair assessment of that difference there?
To an extent, but for example, Zeus is the god of hospitality, and he'll avenge those who defy the laws of hospitality. I think where I think you're onto something is that the our God is much more intimately bound up with our being than the Greek gods are. They have different sources, right? The gods come from one source and the humans come from another source in Greek mythology. Whereas our God doesn't have a source, and we come from him directly. And we are, in a certain sense, his flesh and blood. And I think that's why, for example, I always wondered, why does David say to the Lord in Psalm 51, against thee, thee only have I sinned? If I'm Bathsheba, my thought is, I beg to differ, right? You sinned against me too. But I think it's a parallel to where Jesus says, don't call anybody father, because one is your Father in heaven. It's that sense that when we sin, it's what you just said, that when we sin against another person, it's God against whom we are sinning in that person. And the fact is that person is suffering precisely because we didn't honor God in that person. And so ultimately it is God against whom we have sinned. Right now, we've done things that hurt that other person and damage that other person. Maybe to your point, maybe that's not. You said that sin is an anachronistic term. I don't know how completely anachronistic it would be, because the Greeks did speak of hamartia, and that's that. Literally missing the mark. But I don't know if they'd have conceived it quite the way we do. I don't think so. So I think you're onto something there too. But the idea that when we sin against God. So I might hurt my wife, right? And my wife is the one that feels that pain, but the one whom I dishonored is my God. It's God. And I think that's a really crucial distinction. I think that's incredibly important, what you're saying there.
Yeah. Well, Andrew, we're about out of time. I do need to get going.
I forgot to talk about the Odyssey.
Thanks for. Well, we talked about. We did exactly what I had hoped for, which was to have a natural conversation and to talk about the ideas that the Odyssey raises, rather than going summary by summary, book by book.
All right.
This was a great read through once again for me, and I'll probably put Homer on the shelf for a bit. I think I've read the Iliad and the Odyssey like 3 times in the last 3 years, 3.5 times. And
that's
so
only once a year.
Put him down for. I know. I need to put him down for maybe a year
6
or
months.
2, and then come back to him. Yeah.
Well, let me offer you a suggestion. Next time you pick it up, don't feel like you have to read it beginning to end. Just read a few lines. you've got it now. You've got the Iliad and the Odyssey in your mind, so you know the stories. Just pick them up and read a portion here and there. Someday, 10 years from now, if you want 5 years, whatever, read them beginning to end. But you got them. Just pick them up and read a few lines, or a book, or check a section.
Yeah,
and get a different translation too. That's one of the fun things for me is I read one. I'd never read this one before, by Roman Wes Callahan's new translation, and in fact, sorry, this is total vainglory, but I just have to tell you that he dedicated it.
Oh, right.
To me.
Oh, wow. How about that?
So that's the one I read this time. And, every different translation brings out things that you don't see before. And it's worth it. So don't feel like you have to read the whole book is my point. Get a different translation, just read a part that you're interested in and go, fall asleep to it, whatever.
Yeah. It's a good word. It's a good word. I tried one time listening to portions of it as I was mowing the lawn.
Oh, sure.
It was that was good, but I think it was at a time where it was like a 2 or 3 page simile that he was going on, and it was kind of hard to track without.
What translation was it?
So, I think it's just Fagles. I've whenever I've taught students, I've stuck with this translation for them because usually the students I teach, it's their first dive into it, and so this is probably, I think, the most accessible one. And so I think I was actually preparing for a lesson. So
you might like this one, though. Although it's prose. Some people get offended by the fact that it's prose, but whatever. You can't do everything.
Yeah.
That's why you want multiple translations. Andrew, but anyway, you said you need to go, so I should stop talking.
Well, thanks again. Really appreciate your generosity and your time, your insights, your enthusiasm. It's really, really wonderful.
I love Homer, so thanks you. It's a great. This is the second time we've done a podcast, right? Is it second or third? I think it's
that's
second.
Right.
And I felt very blessed both times, so thank you for that.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you. All right, God bless. Have a good rest of your evening.
Yeah, God bless you too. Thank you.
Thou my best thought, by day or by night, waking or sleeping, thy presence my light.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.